Earlier, my colleague Steve Clemons, editor-at-large of The Hill, had the opportunity to speak with experts on pharmaceutical pricing and research as it relates to rare diseases. Let's take a listen to their conversation.
For our next panel, we're taking a look at some of the factors that go into assessing the value of rare disease treatments, from barriers faced by drug manufacturers when bringing these complex therapies to market, to making treatments accessible to patients who need them most. What data is most essential to bettering our understanding of these life-saving medications? To discuss this and more, I'm now pleased to be joined by two experts on pharmaceutical cost and research and how they relate to rare diseases. Dr. Ji Bai is a professor of healthcare policy and management and a professor of accounting at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Brett McQueen is director of the Center for Pharmaceutical Value at the University of Colorado. You know, folks, this is a topic that is pretty far from me. I'm sort of, remember the Schoolhouse Rock, thing on how a bill becomes a law, and it comes and says, hey, I'm a law. And I just kind of want to have like a Schoolhouse Rock of how a drug gets a price. Hey, I have a price. And so Dr. McQueen, let me just ask you, as you think about pharmaceutical value, and today we're obviously specializing on this question that, there are ailments out there where fewer than 200,000 people have it, and so classified as a rare disease. And to get the incentives right so that therapies and drugs can be developed to do that, we have this problem, but there's not the kind of market there, the same market forces and scalable market forces. I'm just interested in what you do. I don't know if you dream about pricing drugs, but be interested to know what's your North Star, or what are the set of parameters that should help our audience understand what goes into pricing drugs in this rare disease area.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I appreciate you having me on. I think one of the most important things to understand is value assessment, largely the way it's practiced, is a synthesis of existing evidence sources. And that's often a function of regulatory approval through the FDA process, which does provide us with very helpful endpoints. But the problem of actually pricing in rare disease shows a lot of the data gaps that we end up observing through that FDA approval process. And that includes, obviously, small patient populations to test the effectiveness of the therapy. And so that leads us to want to capture more value around the impact that treatment can have on their lives. And it can be quite significant and largely different than what we would consider in other chronic disease areas. So it's a really important thing to understand that the underlying evidence is crucial, and there are a lot of gaps, obviously, with rare disease. And so that's kind of what I try to work on and contribute to and fill those gaps the best I can.
And Dr. Bai, let me ask you the same thing. I love that you're both a professor of health policy and accounting. That's a unlikely pairing, so you get numbers. But as you kind of look at this question of how we get the equilibrium right between the different players, and as Brett McQueen was just talking about, also looking at value, which is really looking at impact, because not all drugs work the same with all people. So there are these lot of squishy dimensions that I want you to make less squishy.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a big counter. I would love to look at this issue from the monetary perspective. Right, drug makers, they have to make money. The reason they focus on one area is because this one area gives them potential return. The return on investment must make sense before the drug makers invest, right? So the rare disease is a category that has received a significant subsidy from taxpayers, from the Orphan Drug Act, right? So these kind of incentives really make a huge difference, motivate drug makers to get into that area, get the most value out of it. At the same time, yes, it does create a lot of value for the patients. I want to mention, not just for that disease itself, it also prevents patients from getting to hospital, right? And that saves a lot of taxpayers' money and the patients' money. So it is from a pharmaceutical perspective, it's really an investment issue. Right. So now when we have a lot of movement, right, on the Hill. I'm right now in DC. It's not far from where those fights are going on. So whenever we change any regulatory constraints or any legislative things, then there will be some impact on the return on investment equation. And then that will have some rippling effect on the downstream. For example, the investors, what they will think, and then eventually patients. However, I want to mention, the Orphan Drug Act was designed to promote innovation. However, evidence and a lot of evidence has already shown some manipulation and abuse. So there has to be some kind of balance, right, from the manufacturer's perspective to limit the political exposure, political costs, and reputation costs, so that eventually investors will be happy, patients will be happy, and that will be a best equilibrium, in my opinion.
Well, let me ask you one other thing, and I'm going to jump back to Brett in just a moment. But Dr. Bai, I understand that you have a worry that if we don't get these incentives right, that you could see a talent drain. You could have a capital drain from this, that the talent will get applied elsewhere because the incentives won't be right. Are you worried in our current climate of that happening? Do we need to do something to juice up the 1983 Orphan Drug Act and to provide, I guess, rejigger the incentives so that attention does stay in this area?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think in general, we must make sure as a nation, we put sufficient incentive into innovation so that we can attract a lot of money, not just from the United States, but from overseas to instill into our innovation, our drug companies, so that we can have the best drug that can be used by Americans as well as eventually everyone in the world. That would be the goal. However, in some specific scenario, let's say the orphan drug situation, rare disease, and we have the incentive. However, there are some kind of actions from manufacturers that creates, the political cost and reputation cost. I do believe whoever on the hill, those policymakers, they have to follow what voters believe. If we have more and more evidence showing that some inappropriate behavior, abusing or manipulating, then that incentive might be gone. The politicians, no matter how much lobbying money they got, they will have to follow what the public believes. However, in general, as I mentioned earlier, we must make sure there's no capital drain. The capital must be, attracted to this area, and no brain drain. If we don't have enough money to support, to give a good incentive for researchers, smart people will have to leave this area to do other things. That will be a huge loss for all of us.
Let me get back to Dr. McQueen. And Doctor, I am a fan, if you will, of the wellness push, the value-based precision medicine, because, I'm very familiar that, one size does not fit all in this sector, but the key is data. And I know my team didn't discuss this out of left field, I'm sure, but I'm really interested in how the data game is going, how health records are going, how transportable and fungible that information is, because my sense is it is very balkanized, that there are a lot of walls, that HIPAA and other things get in the way of the data that someone like you needs. So tell me where I'm wrong with that, because my sense is people just assume that data just flows. But the more I get into it, the more I realize if you're within a hospital system, you can get data there, but sharing between systems, tends to be weak in some cases. And then there are all sorts of other barriers to us accessing the kind of mass data that would be helpful in the kind of work you do.
You're absolutely right. I'm not going to disagree with you at all, Steve. I think one of the challenges, and this came up with PCORI, where PCORNet was developed. And while the advertisement is that the data generated is available widely to the public, that really hasn't become the truth, unfortunately. And further, just beyond that, we see multiple silos, like you said, in these different academic medical centers or community centers where you can only really access the data if you're a partner or if you're a faculty member or a researcher at that group. So I do think there has to be some barrier breaking, so to speak, in terms of making sure that data is available to researchers. And I'm talking large registries that we can access over long periods of time. And the cost should be minimal, because right now, one of the biggest barriers, if it is even available, is the significant cost that companies and researchers have to make to pay for to actually access the data itself. So you're right. You're absolutely right.
And just real quickly, just finally, Dr. Bai, do you find because you're at Johns Hopkins, right? You're just down the road. You're very close to us. But I think, again, looking at health policy, do you think there are public policy responses on, data sharing that need to be put in place? When you look at where the U.S. Health system is, I'm always worried, how can our system become healthier than it is? We're talking about a quadrant of that today with rare diseases. But I am interested in why it's so hard to get the data inputs we need. And I'm just wondering what your perspective is.
Oh, well, I think the players, not only in this case, but in general, would always want to hide the data if hiding data would bring them more benefit, right? So eventually it has to be put enough incentive for the players to voluntarily disclose the data. So there has to be right incentive to make sure not only the eventual users, but the person who actually have to do the disclosure would benefit from it. Eventually it needs to be the incentive and make sure that action has a good return on investment.
Well, I really appreciate this. This is a quick snapshot, far too fast, but I hope you'll both come back and help me get educated, as we kind of talk about how to make this whole health ecosystem smarter and better. Thanks again to Dr. Ji Bai, Professor of Healthcare Policy and Management and Professor of Accounting at Johns Hopkins University, and to Dr. Brett McQueen, Director of the Center for Pharmaceutical Value at the University of Colorado. Thanks to you both.
Thank you for having us.